Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in the Hall of Fire in Rivendell, where ancient voices weave tales of ages long past, where every song carries the weight of thousands of years, where history and legend blur together like smoke rising from the hearth. Tonight, we step into those stories within stories, the folktales and legends that the people of Middle-earth themselves whispered around campfires and sang in great halls. Long before the hobbits ever set foot from the Shire, long before the ring was forged or the kingdoms of men rose to power, there lived a tale so beautiful and tragic that it would echo through all the ages of Middle-earth. This is the story of Beren and Luthien, a tale that even the Fellowship knew, a legend that gave hope to those who faced impossible odds. Picture, if you will, the great forests of Doriath in the first age of the world, when the elves were at the height of their power and glory, when magic still flowed freely through Middle-earth like water in a mountain stream. The kingdom of Doriath was wrapped in enchantment, protected by a girdle of power, woven by Melian the Maya, one of the immortal spirits who had come to Middle-earth at the beginning of time. Within those protected borders, beneath the ancient trees, lived Luthien Tinuviel, the most beautiful being ever to walk the earth. She was the daughter of two impossibilities. Her father was Thingol, the greatest of the elven kings, proud and powerful beyond measure. Her mother was Melian, not an elf at all, but one of the Maya, an angelic being of tremendous power. In Luthien's veins flowed both the grace of the Eldar and the divine essence of the Aenir. When she danced in the forest glades, flowers would bloom beneath her feet. When she sang, even the birds would fall silent to listen, and nightingales would follow her through the woods, trying to learn the melodies that seemed to come from beyond the circles of the world itself. For countless years, Luthien lived in joy and peace within her father's realm, sheltered from the darkness that threatened the rest of Middle-earth. But beyond the borders of Doriath, a war raged. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, the master of Sauron, who would later forge the One Ring, ruled from his fortress of Angband in the frozen north. His shadow lay heavy upon the land, and those who opposed him fought desperate battles with little hope of victory. Among those who resisted the darkness was Barahir, a lord of men, one of the brave and doomed warriors who refused to bow before Morgoth's might. Barahir and his small band of followers held out in the highlands of Dorthonion, striking at the enemy where they could, living as outlaws in their own land. Morgoth hated these men with particular fury, for they would not be broken, would not despair, would not surrender. He set all his cunning toward their destruction. Through treachery, Morgoth's servants slaughtered Barahir and all his companions save one. That one was Beren, Barahir's son, who returned from a scouting mission to find the bodies of his father and all his friends lying cold upon the ground. From his father's hand, he took a ring, a gift once given by an elven prince, proof of friendship between elves and men. Then Beren fled south, hunted by orcs and wolves, alone and desperate, with nothing but his courage and the memory of his father's defiance. For 4 long years, Beren wandered as an outlaw, harried by Morgoth's servants, living on the edge of survival. His deeds in those years became legendary, for though he was alone, he struck such fear into the orcs that they would not enter certain valleys and mountain passes. Songs were sung of his bravery, even in the dark halls of Angband, though they were songs of hatred from the mouths of those who feared him. At last, more dead than alive, Beren crossed the mountains of terror, where giant spiders descended from Ungoliant herself made their lairs. Few who entered those haunted passes ever emerged, but Beren passed through, driven by desperation and fate. He came down into the forests of Doriath, passing somehow through the magical barrier that should have turned him aside, and there, in a glade beneath hemlock trees, he saw something that changed him forever. Luthien was dancing. The moonlight fell upon her through the branches, and she moved like starlight given form, singing a song that seemed to come from the very heart of creation. Beren, this mortal man who had seen nothing but death and darkness for years, stood transfixed. He called out to her, calling her Tinuviel, which means nightingale, and when she turned to him, their eyes met across that moonlit clearing, and both their fates were sealed in that moment. But love between mortal and immortal is no simple thing. When Thingol learned that his daughter had fallen in love with a mortal man, one of the race that he had little reason to love or trust, his pride and anger knew no bounds. He would not slay Beren, for that would break his daughter's heart, and he would not simply cast him out, for that might lead Luthien to follow. So Thingol set before Beren a task that he believed utterly impossible, a quest that would send the mortal man to his death, while technically giving him what he asked for. The bride price Thingol demanded was this: Beren must bring him a Silmaril from the Iron Crown of Morgoth himself. To understand the audacity and impossibility of this demand, you must understand what the Silmarils were. They were 3 jewels crafted by Feanor, the greatest of all elven craftsmen, gems that held within them the light of the 2 trees of Valinor, the light that existed before the sun and moon were made. They were the most beautiful and holy objects in all of creation, and Morgoth had stolen them, killing Feanor's father in the theft, and had set them in his iron crown. He never removed that crown, and he sat in the deepest throne room of Angband, surrounded by countless servants, Balrogs and dragons and legions of orcs. To approach Morgoth was death. To touch his crown was inconceivable. Yet Beren accepted this quest. He looked Thingol in the eye and swore that he would return with a Silmaril in his hand. And then he walked out of Doriath to accomplish the impossible. Luthien, of course, could not simply let him go. She was no damsel to sit and wait. She followed him in secret, and when he discovered her presence, their true adventure began together. What followed was an epic that deserves its own lengthy telling, but I will give you the essence of it here, for this is how it was remembered and retold throughout the ages. Beren and Luthien journeyed together toward Angband, and along the way they met Finrod Felagund, an elven king who owed a debt to Beren's father. Finrod accompanied them, and they attempted to reach Angband in disguise. But Sauron, who in those days served Morgoth and held a fortress at Tol Garhoth, perceived their deception. Finrod and Sauron engaged in a duel of songs, a battle of power conducted through music and words, verse against verse, spell against spell. Finrod sang of freedom and the light of Valinor, while Sauron sang of treachery and darkness and the slow grinding of hope beneath the weight of despair. In the end, Sauron proved the stronger, and Finrod and his companions, including Beren, were cast into the dungeons of Tol Garhoth. One by one, the prisoners were devoured by werewolves. Finrod himself died protecting Beren, wrestling with a werewolf with his bare hands and his teeth, refusing to let the beast harm his friend even as his own life bled away. This was the sacrifice of the Elven King, payment of his father's debt in the most complete way possible. But Luthien came to that terrible place. She came alone, and she stood before the gates of Sauron's fortress and sang. Her voice rose up like a challenge and a promise, beautiful beyond measure, and her song spoke of things that even Sauron had once known, of light and peace and the world as it was meant to be before Morgoth twisted it. The stones of the fortress trembled, the foundations shook, and the terrible lieutenant of Morgoth found himself, perhaps for the first time in ages, feeling something like fear. Sauron sent his wolves against her, including his mightiest servant, but they fell before the power of her song. At last, Sauron himself came forth in wolf form to face her, but Luthien cast her magical cloak over him and sang a song of sleep and defeat. Sauron fled, abandoning his fortress rather than face this being who was half divine and wholly terrible in her righteous power. The fortress fell. The prisoners were freed. But of all Finrod's company, only Beren still lived, and he wept for the sacrifice of the king who had died for him. With nothing to keep them, Beren and Luthien continued toward Angband, though Beren tried to convince Luthien to return home, knowing that what lay ahead promised only death. They approached the gates of Angband itself, that hellish fortress carved deep into the mountains of the north, where the smoke of Morgoth's forges darkened the sky, and the screams of the tortured echoed from the pits. They approached in disguise. Beren wore the skin of a werewolf that Luthien had defeated, while she took the form of a vampire. Thus disguised, they passed the gates and came down into the throne room, where Morgoth sat upon his chair, the 3 Silmarils blazing in his crown. Even in disguise, even with Luthien's magic to aid them, they could not have succeeded through stealth alone. So Luthien revealed herself and stood before the Dark Lord, before the enemy of the world, before the being that even the other Valar feared to face in single combat. And she danced for him, and she sang. Her song was of sleep, of rest, of an end to struggle and strife. Even Morgoth, who had sung discord into the music of creation itself, who had broken and twisted so much of the world, even he was moved by that singing. His eyes grew heavy, the iron crown tilted upon his brow, and the Dark Lord, who had never known defeat in his own realm, who had sat upon that throne for ages uncounted, slowly fell into slumber. The Balrogs drowsed, the wolves slept, the very foundations of Angband seemed to pause in their industry, and Beren, mortal man, armed with a knife forged by Luthien's arts, climbed onto the body of sleeping Morgoth and cut a Silmaril from his crown. The blade scraped against iron. Morgoth stirred in his sleep, and Beren's heart nearly stopped with terror. But the Dark Lord did not wake. Emboldened, Beren sought to cut free a second Silmaril, then a third, to take all 3 and end Morgoth's triumph completely. But the blade snapped. It struck the iron crown and shattered, and a shard of metal flew up and cut Morgoth's cheek. The Dark Lord began to wake. All of Angband stirred like a vast beast disturbed from sleep. Beren and Luthien fled, running through the halls of the enemy, and behind them came roars of rage that shook the mountains. At the gates of Angband dwelt Karkaroth, the greatest wolf that had ever lived, a beast fed on living flesh by Morgoth himself, bred for size and savagery beyond imagining. This wolf barred their escape, and when Beren held up his hand with the Silmaril blazing in his fist, thinking to use the holy light to make the beast cringe back, Karkaroth instead lunged forward and bit off Beren's hand at the wrist, swallowing both hand and Silmaril in one bite. The holy light burning in the wolf's belly drove it mad. Karkaroth howled and fled, running wild with the pain of that sacred light consuming it from within. And in that moment of chaos, Beren and Luthien escaped, carried away by the eagles that served Manwë, lord of the Valar. They returned to Doriath. Beren stood before Thingol, and the king asked mockingly, where was the Silmaril he had demanded? Beren held up his arm, now ending in a stump where his right hand had been, and he said that a Silmaril rested in his hand still, though hand and jewel both were currently in the belly of a wolf. It was a moment of both tragedy and dark humour, and even Thingol could not remain angry in the face of such grim courage. But the tale was not yet ended. Carcharoth, maddened by the burning of the Silmaril within him, came raging into Doriath, breaking through even Melion's girdle of power in his agony and fury. A great hunt was called, and Thingol, Beren and others went forth to slay the wolf. They found it, and in the battle that followed, the great hound Huan, who had followed Luthien from distant lands, fought Carcharoth to the death. Both perished in that combat, but not before the maddened wolf bit Beren, dealing him a mortal wound. They cut open the wolf's belly and retrieved the Silmaril, and Beren, dying, placed the jewel into Thingol's hand, fulfilling his oath even with his last strength. Then Beren died, and Luthien's grief was beyond the power of words to express. She faded, withering as a flower withers, and her spirit fled from Middle-earth to the halls of Mandos, where the dead are judged, and where the spirits of elves wait until the world ends. But Luthien would not accept this parting. She came before Mandos himself, the Valar who judges the dead, and she sang for him. She sang of love and loss, of the brief, beautiful time she had shared with Beren, of the sorrow of both elves and men, of the doom that lay upon them all, of the price paid for love and courage. Never before or since has such a song been sung in the halls of Mandos. The Valar, stern and implacable in his judgments, was moved to tears. He consulted with Manwë, the elder king, and together they made a decision without precedent. They would allow Beren to return to life, and with him, Luthien could return also. But there was a price. Luthien would have to become mortal. She would give up her immortality, her place among the Eldar, her birthright as a child of both elves and Maiar. She would live a mortal span with Beren, and when that span ended, both would pass beyond the circles of the world to whatever fate awaited the souls of men, a fate unknown even to the Valar. Luthien chose Beren. She chose love over immortality, chose a brief mortal life over an eternity without him. They returned to Middle-earth together, and they lived in peace for a time in a hidden land, far from the wars and troubles of the age. They had a son, Dior, who inherited the beauty of his mother and the courage of his father. And when their time came, they died as mortals die, and they passed beyond the world together. This was the tale that echoed through all the ages that followed. It was the tale that Aragorn sang to the hobbits on Weathertop, speaking of Luthien dancing in the forest while Beren watched. It was the tale that Sam remembered when he stood in Ithilien, understanding that he and Frodo had become part of a story greater than themselves, walking the same paths as heroes of old. It was the tale that Elrond remembered when he looked upon his daughter Arwen and the mortal man she loved, seeing in them the echo of his own distant ancestors. For through Luthien and Beren, mortal and immortal were forever joined. Their son Dior inherited both the kingdom of Doriath and the Silmaril his father had won. Dior's daughter Elwing married Erendil the Mariner, and their sons were Elrond and Elros, the fathers of the elves and the men of Númenor. In Aragorn's veins flowed the blood of Beren and Luthien. In Arwen's also. The greatest love story of the elder days lived on in their descendants, a promise that the divisions between the peoples of Middle-earth could be bridged, that love could overcome even death itself, that mortal courage and immortal grace could be united. The tale of Beren and Luthien was sung in the halls of elves and remembered in the lore of men. It was a story that gave hope to the hopeless, that reminded those who heard it that the impossible could sometimes be achieved, that love was a power as great as any magic, that even the dark lords of the world could be defied by those who had something worth fighting for. And when Aragorn and Arwen chose each other, with Arwen accepting mortality for love as her ancestor had done ages before, the tale came full circle, proving that some stories never truly end but live on, generation after generation, finding new life in new hearts. The tragedy that cannot be escaped. Turin Turambar. If the tale of Beren and Luthien is the greatest love story of Middle-earth, then the tale of Turin Turambar is its greatest tragedy, a story so dark and terrible that even those who told it in later ages could barely bring themselves to speak all its horrors. Yet it was remembered, preserved in the long memory of the elves, passed down as a warning and as a testament to the cruelty of Morgoth and the weight of fate. In the time when Morgoth's power was at its height, when the kingdoms of the elves were falling one by one, and darkness covered the lands of the north, there lived a man named Hurin Thalion, which means Hurin the Steadfast. He was a lord of the House of Hardur, one of the great families of men who had allied themselves with the elves against the enemy. Hurin fought in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, that terrible conflict in which the armies of elves and men were utterly defeated before the gates of Angband. The battle was lost. The army was scattered and destroyed, but Hurin fought on with his brother Hor until Hor fell, and then Hurin stood alone, wielding his great axe, cutting down orcs and trolls and any servant of Morgoth who came near. With each blow he cried out, Oren Tuluva, which means, day shall come again. Even in the midst of defeat, even as his friends died around him and the enemy closed in, Hurin defied the darkness and proclaimed that the dominion of Morgoth would not last forever. At last, overwhelmed by numbers, Hurin was captured alive and brought before Morgoth himself. The Dark Lord offered him freedom, offered him power, asked only that Hurin reveal the location of Gondolin, the last great elven kingdom, which remained hidden from Morgoth's searching eye. And Hurin, battered and bound, looked into the face of the enemy and refused. He mocked Morgoth to his face. He laughed at the Dark Lord's offers and scorned his power. Morgoth, who could break almost anyone, who could corrupt and twist the strongest wills, could not break Hurin's spirit. So the Dark Lord did something crueler. He cursed Hurin and all his family. He cursed his children and their children, dooming them to lives of sorrow and darkness. And then Morgoth bound Hurin to a chair high in the mountains and forced him to watch through the Dark Lord's own vision as the curse unfolded, as everything Hurin loved was destroyed, as his family fell into ruin and despair, and he could do nothing but watch and weep. Hurin's son was Turin, born in the spring that followed the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. He never knew his father, for Hurin never returned from that battle. Turin grew up in a house of women and servants, in a land under the shadow of the enemy, where Morgoth's forces now ruled and men served them in fear. His mother Morwen, proud and sorrowful, managed to keep their small household safe for a time, but she knew it could not last. So she sent young Turin to Doriath to the kingdom of Thingol, begging the elven king to foster her son. Thingol, remembering the bravery of Húrin and the friendship between elves and men, took Turin into his household and raised him as if he were a prince of Doriath. Turin grew tall and dark-haired, more like the elves in appearance than the men of his own kindred. He was fierce and proud, brave to the point of recklessness, gifted with weapons and with words. He learned the arts of the elves, their music and their lore, their ways of war and their languages. He became Thingol's foster son, beloved by many, yet always set apart, for in his heart was a grief he could not name, a shadow he could not escape. But Morgoth's curse worked in him. Turin was proud, too proud, quick to anger and slow to forgive. When another elf mocked his poverty and his mortal blood, Turin pursued him through the forest in rage. The elf, fleeing, fell to his death by accident, and though Turin had not struck the fatal blow, he blamed himself. Rather than accept Thingol's pardon, rather than stay in Doriath where he was loved and valued, Turin's pride drove him to exile himself, to leave the safety of the kingdom and become an outlaw in the wild. He fell in with a band of desperate men who lived by robbery and violence, and in time, Turin became their leader. But he tried to guide them toward better purposes, to fight against Morgoth's servants rather than prey on the weak. His fame grew. Men sang of Turin, Gortal, the warrior in black who struck from the shadows, who gave no mercy to orcs and defended those who could not defend themselves. Yet the curse followed him. When his closest friend from Doriath, the elf Beleg, came to bring him back to Thingol's service, Turin's band captured Beleg, thinking him an enemy. By the time Turin discovered the truth, Beleg had been tormented and nearly killed. Together, Turin and Beleg left the outlaws and travelled to the hidden elven kingdom of Nargothrond, one of the last great strongholds of the elves. In Nargothrond, Turin rose high in the councils of the king. He was given a great black sword, reforged from a blade that had belonged to Beleg. He named the sword Gurtang, which means Iron of Death, and with it he became a terror to Morgoth's forces. Turin convinced the king to abandon stealth and caution, to fight openly against the enemy, and for a time, they had great success. Turin was acclaimed as a hero, a champion of the elves, and his pride swelled. But Morgoth learned of Nargothrond's location. He sent against it Glaurung, the father of dragons, a creature of terrible size and power, whose eyes could bewitch the mind and whose breath was flame. The armies of Nargothrond marched out to face this threat, and they were utterly destroyed. Turin survived, but the king fell, and Nargothrond was overrun. Turin rushed to the sack of the city, hoping to save those trapped within. Among the prisoners, he saw the woman he loved, Finduilas, daughter of the king, being dragged away by orcs. He made to pursue them to rescue her, but Glaurung intercepted him. The dragon's eyes caught Turin's gaze, and the great worm spoke to him, telling him that his mother and sister were living in poverty and danger in the north, abandoned and suffering while he played at being an elven hero in the south. The words struck Turin like a blow. His pride shattered. His sense of duty to his family overwhelmed all other considerations. Against his will, he turned from saving Finduilas and went north to find his mother. It was a deception, Morgoth's curse working through the dragon's lies. Turin's mother and sister had already fled their home and were safe in Doriath. By the time Turin learned this, it was too late. Finduilas had been murdered by the orcs who held her, killed when Turin failed to pursue. When Turin finally tracked down where she had been taken, he found only a grave. Broken by grief and guilt, Turin came to the forest of Brethil, to the people of the Haladin, one of the houses of men who still resisted Morgoth's dominion. There he took a new name, calling himself Turambar, which means Master of Fate, declaring that he would no longer be ruled by doom and sorrow, that he would master his own destiny at last. For a time, it seemed he might succeed. He found peace among these simple folk. He became their leader, defending them against orcs and wolves. One day, he found a young woman on the grave mound of Finduilas, naked and speechless, with no memory of who she was or where she came from. She could only weep, so he named her Niniel, which means tear maiden. He took her into his care, and slowly she recovered her ability to speak, though her memories never returned. They grew close. They fell in love. They married, and for the first time in his life, Turin knew something approaching happiness. Niniel was with child, and Turin dared to hope that the curse might finally be broken. But Glaurung came again. The dragon had left Nargothrond, and now came to destroy the people of Brethil. Turin, who had become their war leader, gathered a small group of companions and went to face the dragon. He planned an ambush, approaching from below, while Glaurung crossed a ravine, striking at the worm's unarmored belly. The plan succeeded. Turin drove Gurthang, his black sword, deep into Glaurung's heart, dealing the dragon a mortal wound. But in pulling the sword free, Turin was splashed with the dragon's black blood, and the venom overcame him. He fell into a swoon that resembled death. Niniel, hearing of the battle, rushed to the ravine, desperate to find her husband. She found Turin lying still beside the dying dragon, and she thought him dead. Glaurung, in his last moments, opened his eyes and looked upon Niniel. With his dying breath, spoke to her, and his words broke the spell of forgetfulness that had clouded her mind. He told her who she truly was, not some nameless foundling, but Nienor, daughter of Húrin, sister to Turin. The woman she had fallen in love with, the man she had married, the father of the child she carried, was her own brother. The horror of this revelation was absolute. Nienor, her memory returned, and her mind shattered by the knowledge of what she had unknowingly done, threw herself into the ravine and died. When Turin woke from his swoon and learned what had happened, he too was destroyed. He had caused the death of everyone he had ever loved. He had failed to save Finduilas. He had unwittingly married his own sister. Everything he had tried to do, every attempt to master his fate, had only made the tragedy worse. Turin spoke to his sword, asking it whether it would take his life as it had taken so many others. The sword, in the way of enchanted things in that age, answered him, saying it would drink his blood as readily as any other. Turin drove the blade into the earth and cast himself upon it, and so died Turin Turambar, the greatest warrior of his age and the most tragic. His mother Morwen, who had spent years searching for her children, found his grave. She died of grief beside it, and Húrin, finally released from Morgoth's binding, came also and found his wife dead and his children in the earth. The curse was complete. Morgoth's revenge upon the man who had defied him was absolute. The tale of Turin was remembered as a warning of how pride and anger could corrupt even the noblest intentions. How fate and free will could become tangled together until it was impossible to tell which was which. How the enemy could turn a man's own virtues against him. It was a dark tale, with little hope in it, and yet it was told because it was true, because it was part of the history of those days, because forgetting such things would mean forgetting the price that was paid in the war against Morgoth. In the Third Age, when Elrond spoke to Frodo about the burden of the ring and the weight of impossible quests, he mentioned Turin among the heroes of old, placing him alongside Beren and others who had faced darkness and not turned aside. Even in tragedy, there was valor. Even in defeat, there was courage. The tale of Turin was a reminder that sometimes the enemy wins, that not all stories have happy endings, but that the struggle itself matters, that choosing to fight even when doomed is its own form of victory. The Hidden Kingdom and its fall. The tale of Gondolin. Among the great tales of the First Age, the story of the fall of Gondolin holds a special place, for it was the last story to be completed and published in full, and it represents both the hope of the elves and their ultimate defeat. This tale was whispered in the halls of Rivendell and recorded in the ancient books that Bilbo studied during his long sojourn among the elves. It tells of the hidden city of Gondolin, of its glory and its doom, and of Tor, the mortal man who became the instrument of prophecy. In the dark years following the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, when Morgoth seemed triumphant and the kingdoms of the elves were falling one by one, there remained one last great stronghold hidden from the enemy's sight. This was Gondolin, the hidden city, built by King Turgon in a secret valley encircled by mountains. The city was a wonder of beauty and craft, with fountains and towers, with gardens and great houses, a place where the arts of the elves still flourished, even as darkness covered the rest of the world. The city had been hidden by the power of Ulmo, the Vala, who was Lord of Waters, one of the mightiest of the powers that shaped the world. Ulmo had not forgotten Middle-earth, though the other Vala had mostly turned their faces away after the rebellion of the Noldor. He worked in secret to preserve what could be preserved, to give hope where hope seemed lost, and Gondolin was his greatest effort to keep alive the light of the elves. For centuries, Gondolin endured, unknown to Morgoth, despite all his searching. Its people lived in relative peace while war and sorrow reigned outside their mountain walls. But Ulmo knew that this could not last forever. He foresaw that eventually Gondolin would be discovered and destroyed, unless its people took action. So he chose a messenger to send to Turgon, a mortal man named Tur, son of Hor, who was cousin to Turin Turambar. Tur's father had died in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and his mother, upon hearing of her husband's death, went into the wild and died of grief, leaving her infant son to be fostered by elves in the mountains. Tur grew up as an outlander, living in the caves and highlands, learning the ways of the wild. When he was of age, he tried to escape south to the Havens, but he was captured and enslaved by Easterlings who served Morgoth. For 3 years, Tur labored in bondage, but his spirit was never broken, and at last he escaped and lived as an outlaw in the wilderness. Ulmo had been watching over Tur, guiding his steps, though the man knew it not. The Vala appeared to Tur in a vision, rising from the sea in a great storm, and spoke to him directly, giving him a mission. He was to find the hidden city of Gondolin and deliver a warning to King Turgon. Morgoth was close to discovering the city's location, and unless Turgon led his people away, abandoning Gondolin and fleeing to the Havens to seek the aid of the Vala across the sea, all would be lost. Ulmo gave Tur a guide, an elf named Voronwe, who had been one of Turgon's mariners, sent years before to sail to Valinor and plead for aid. The mission had failed, but Voronwe alone had survived, saved by Ulmo and washed ashore precisely where Tur would find him. Together, Tur and Veronwë journeyed through the winter toward Gondolin, evading orcs and enduring great hardship. Along their journey, they caught a brief glimpse of another figure in the distance, a tall man in black, carrying a black sword. It was Turin, and though they did not know it, the paths of these two cousins crossed in that moment, the only time they would ever be near each other. One was going to his doom, the other to his destiny, and they passed like ships in the night, never meeting. Tur and Veronwë reached the hidden gates of Gondolin, passing through the 7 gates set in the mountain walls, each more cunningly wrought than the last. When at last Tur stood before King Turgon in the great city, he delivered Ulmo's message. But Turgon, proud and stubborn, refused to believe that Gondolin could fall. He had spent centuries building this city. It was proof against the enemy, or so he believed. He would not abandon it on the word of a mortal man, messenger of Ulmo or not. Tur tried to persuade him, pleading that all the hopes of elves and men depended on reaching the Valar and seeking their pardon and aid. But Turgon was unmoved. Instead, he invited Tur to remain in Gondolin, to dwell in the city and make it his home. Tur, weary of wandering and captivated by the beauty of the place, agreed. He learned the lore of the elves. He was given armor and weapons worthy of a prince. He became great among the people of the city, and he fell in love with Idril Celebrimbor, the king's daughter. Idril was beautiful and wise, with silver golden hair and keen insight that saw deeper than most. She was Turgon's only child, and when she and Tur fell in love, Turgon gave them his blessing. Their marriage was celebrated throughout the city, one of the few unions between elf and mortal, echoing the ancient tale of Beren and Luthien. But not everyone rejoiced. Meglin, Turgon's nephew and a prince of the city, had long desired Idril for himself. When she chose Tur instead, his heart filled with jealousy and hatred. He hid these feelings, but they festered like a wound. Tur and Idril had a son, and they named him Eärendil. From birth, the child seemed touched by destiny, beautiful beyond measure, with the strength and courage of men and the grace and wisdom of elves. His birth brought joy to Gondolin, but Idril, who had the gift of foresight, felt a shadow over her happiness. She sensed that danger was coming, and in secret, without telling even her father, she ordered the construction of a hidden tunnel from her house, a secret way out of the city that might serve as an escape route if the worst should happen. Her foresight proved true. Meglin, in his pride and anger, defied Turgon's law and ventured beyond the mountains to prospect for ores, hoping to find metals for his smithcraft. But he was captured by orcs and brought before Morgoth. The Dark Lord tormented Meglin and then offered him a choice: reveal the location of Gondolin and how to overcome its defenses, or die in agony. Worse, Morgoth promised that if Meglin betrayed the city, he would be made Lord of Gondolin and given Idril as his prize. The torture and the promise together broke Meglin's will. He revealed everything: the location of the city, the weakness in its defenses, the best time to attack. Morgoth sent him back to Gondolin, and Meglin returned in secret, pretending that nothing had happened, waiting for the doom he had set in motion. The attack came on a festival day in summer, when all the people were celebrating and their guard was down. Morgoth sent against Gondolin an army unlike any that had been seen. Legions of orcs, packs of wolves, hosts of balrogs and dragons. Great dragons of fire, some with wings, came over the mountains or broke through the passes, and against such might, the defences of Gondolin could not stand. The battle that followed was terrible beyond words. The houses of the city rallied, each forming their own battalion to fight the invaders. Glorfindel of the House of the Golden Flower fought with incredible valour. Ecthelion of the Fountain slew Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, though both perished in that duel. Tur fought like a hero of legend, rallying the defenders, protecting the civilians, seeking to save what could be saved. But the city was doomed. The dragons set fire to the buildings. The orcs swarmed through the streets. King Turgon himself fell defending his tower, and the tower collapsed with him inside it. Maeglin, in the chaos, tried to seize Idril and Eärendil, thinking to claim his promised prize. But Tur confronted him on the walls of the city, and in their struggle, Tur threw Maeglin from the heights to fall to his death far below, a traitor's end. Tur gathered what survivors he could find and led them to Idril's secret tunnel. They escaped through the mountain and fled across the plain, while Gondolin burned behind them. They were pursued by orcs and a Balrog, and at the rear guard, Glorfindel fought the demon of fire. Both fell from a precipice and perished, but Glorfindel's sacrifice bought time for the refugees to escape. The eagles came and drove off the remaining orcs, and the survivors continued their desperate flight south. They came at last to the mouths of Sirion, where they joined other refugees from fallen kingdoms, elves and men who had survived the wars. There they built a final settlement, the last refuge of those who still resisted Morgoth. And there, as Eärendil grew to manhood, the seeds were planted for the final hope of Middle-earth. For Tur and Idril's son would become Eärendil the Mariner, who would sail to Valinor and plead before the Valar for aid, succeeding where all others had failed. Through his voyage, the Valar would at last be moved to intervene, and they would come to Middle-earth with all their power and overthrow Morgoth, ending the First Age and changing the world forever. The tale of Gondolin's fall was remembered as both tragedy and hope. It showed that even the mightiest works could fall, that no fortress was impregnable, that pride and secrecy could not shield against betrayal. But it also showed that from ruin could come renewal, that the survivors of disaster could carry on the light even when all seemed lost, that a mortal man and an elven woman could forge a legacy that would save the world. When the people of later ages spoke of Gondolin, they spoke with wonder and sorrow, remembering the beauty that had been and the courage of those who died defending it. The tale was preserved because it was part of the great story of the elder days, and because in it, as in all the great tales, there were lessons about valor and sacrifice, about the price of defiance, and about the strange workings of fate that could bring salvation from disaster. Songs of power and the magic of words. In Middle-earth, songs were never merely entertainment. They were vessels of power, carriers of history, and sometimes weapons more potent than any sword. The people of that world understood what many have forgotten, that words spoken with intention, formed into verse and music, could shape reality itself, could preserve memory across the ages, and could move even the hearts of the powers. The greatest example of this is found at the very beginning, in the creation of the world itself. The tale called Ainulindale, the music of the Ainu, describes how all of creation began with a song. Eru Ilúvatar, the one who is above all, proposed themes to the Ainu, the spirits who existed before the world. These beings sang, and their voices wove together in a great music that was more beautiful than anything that would ever exist in the world to come. They sang variations on the themes Ilúvatar had presented, and, as they sang, they saw visions of what their music was creating. But one of the Ainur, Melkor, who would later become Morgoth, desired to create themes of his own, rather than harmonize with the others. He wove discord into the music, trying to dominate it and bend it to his will. The music became a struggle between the unity of Ilúvatar's themes and Melkor's violent counter-melodies. 3 times, Ilúvatar raised his hand and introduced new themes, each time incorporating Melkor's discord into a greater harmony, showing that even rebellion and destruction could be woven into the ultimate purpose of creation. When the music ended, Ilúvatar showed the Ainur what their song had created, a vision of the world that would be, with all its lands and seas, its peoples and their histories. Then he gave that vision substance and reality, saying, "Hey, let these things be." And the world was made, shaped by music, existing as a physical manifestation of the song that had been sung. This understanding of the creative power of music and words permeated all of Middle-earth's cultures. The elves, especially, were masters of songs of power. When Lúthien stood before Sauron's fortress and sang, she wasn't merely making pleasant sounds. She was wielding power, shaping reality through the force of her voice and will. When she sang before Morgoth, she was engaging in a contest as real as any battle, pitting her magic against his, and for a time at least, she prevailed. The duel between Finrod Felagund and Sauron on the bridge of Tol in Garhoth was another example of song as warfare. Each singer wove spells with their verses, attacking and defending with words and music. Finrod sang of freedom and light, of the beauty of Valinor and the hope of the elves. Sauron sang of treachery and darkness, of betrayal and the triumph of despair. The battle swayed back and forth until at last Sauron's power proved the greater, and Finrod and his companions were captured. But songs were not only weapons, they were also the primary means of preserving history and lore. The elves, with their perfect memories and their lives that stretched across ages, could remember songs exactly as they had been taught, passing them down unchanged through thousands of years. The great tales of the First Age were preserved as songs and sung in the halls of Rivendell and Lothlorien. When Aragorn sang part of the Lay of Lithien to the hobbits, he was not just telling them a story, but giving them access to lore that stretched back thousands of years, preserved in verse that had been passed down from singer to singer across all that time. The Lay of Lithien itself was one of the longest and most detailed of these ancient songs. It told the story of Beren and Lúthien in verse form, going into detail about every stage of their quest, every challenge they faced, every moment of courage and despair. It was composed originally by minstrels who had heard the tale from those who lived through those times, and it was refined and added to over the generations until it became a masterwork of elvish poetry. But songs were not the only form of powerful words in Middle-earth. Prophecies and riddles also carried weight, shaping the future even as they described it. When the Witch King of Angmar heard the prophecy that no living man could slay him, he took comfort in it, believing himself invincible. He did not realize that the words allowed for other possibilities, that a woman and a halfling together might accomplish what men could not. Riddles, too, were more than games. When Bilbo matched wits with Gollum in the dark under the misty mountains, they were engaging in a tradition as old as language itself. Riddles were tests of wisdom and cunning, and in that desperate game, Bilbo's final question, "What have I got in my pocket?" was both a cheat and a stroke of genius that saved his life and changed the fate of the world. Even among the hobbits, who had no great magic and whose songs were mostly about food and drink and comfortable things, there was an understanding of the importance of words and verses. Their walking songs, their bath songs, their songs about dragons and adventure were all ways of preserving their culture and identity. Sam's songs, simple as they seemed, carried the spirit of the Shire with him into the darkness of Mordor, reminding him of what he was fighting for. One of the most powerful examples of song in the Third Age came when Frodo was recovering in Rivendell after being wounded by the Witch King. In the Hall of Fire, Bilbo recited a song he had composed about Eärendil the Mariner. The song told of how Eärendil sailed to Valinor and pleaded before the Valar, how he was transformed into a star that would forever sail the sky, a sign of hope to all the peoples of Middle-earth. As Bilbo sang, the elves listened in silence, and when he finished, they praised him, for he had captured something of the truth and beauty of the ancient tale. The elves themselves had many songs that went beyond mere history. Galadriel's lament in Lothlorien, which he sang in the ancient elvish tongue of Quenya, spoke of loss and memory, of the fading of the elves in Middle-earth, and their longing for the West. The words she sang were simple in one sense, speaking of stars and the long roads of the world, but they carried the weight of ages of experience, of watching kingdoms rise and fall, of seeing friends die while she endured. The song that Aragorn sang to call upon the army of the dead was another example of words carrying power. He spoke to them in the language of oath-breaking and duty, reminding them of what they had sworn and failed to fulfill. His words reached the dead where mere force could not, compelling them to answer his summons and march to war one final time to redeem themselves. Even Gandalf, who wielded great power in many forms, understood the importance of words. His spellcrafting often took the form of words of command, and when he faced the Balrog on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, he did not merely fight with his staff and sword. He spoke words of power, naming himself as a servant of the secret fire and declaring that the Balrog could not pass. Those words were not merely defiance. They were an assertion of authority, a claiming of power that gave force to his resistance. The power of naming was also significant. To know the true name of something was to have power over it. This is why Gandalf used many names: Mithrandir to the elves, Tharkun to the dwarves, Olorin, as he was known in Valinor before coming to Middle-earth. Each name reflected a different aspect of his being and purpose. When Tom Bombadil saved the hobbits from the Barrow Wight, he did so partly through the use of commands and names, asserting his will over the evil spirit. The tradition of preserving lore in songs and verses had practical benefits beyond the magical. In a world where books were rare and many people could not read, songs were the primary way of ensuring that important knowledge was not lost. A minstrel could carry an entire library of lore in their memory, passing it on to apprentices who would memorize the songs in turn. This is why the elves valued their singers so highly, why even a warrior like Elrond maintained halls where songs were sung each evening, why the lore masters of the elves were so often also musicians. The hobbits, when they returned to the Shire after the War of the Ring, found that their adventures had already passed into song. Minstrels sang of Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom, and Sam heard verses about the quest that made him both proud and uncomfortable. This was how the great events of history were preserved and passed down, transformed into art, so that they could be remembered and celebrated by generations who had not been there. In the Fourth Age and beyond, as the magical powers faded from Middle-earth and the elves departed for the West, the songs remained. They became part of the heritage of men, passing into legend and mythology, changing gradually as they were retold. The very story that we call The Lord of the Rings is presented as a translation of the Red Book of Westmarch, a chronicle compiled by hobbits from their own experiences and from the songs and records of the elves. The songs within songs, the tales within tales, this layering of narrative and verse reflects the deep truth that stories and songs are how cultures preserve their identity and their wisdom across the gulf of years. Legends of powers beyond the world. The people of Middle-earth in the Third Age, going about their daily lives, farming and trading and fighting their small wars, were living in the shadow of beings and events that stretch back to the beginning of time itself. The gods who had shaped the world, the catastrophes that had changed its very geography, the ancient powers that still lingered in hidden places. All of these form the deep background of existence, the myths that explained why the world was as it was. The Valar were the powers that governed the world, beings of tremendous might who had come into the world at its creation to shape it and prepare it for the coming of elves and men. They were not gods in the sense of being creators. That role belonged to Eru Ilúvatar alone. But they were the caretakers and stewards of creation, each given dominion over different aspects of the world. Manwë was their king, the lord of winds and birds, who dwelt on the highest mountain in Valinor, and from there looked out over all the lands of the world. His spouse was Varda, whom the elves called Elbereth, the queen of the stars. She it was who had kindled the stars before the moon and sun were made, setting lights in the sky that guided the elves when they first awoke. The elves loved Varda above all the Valar, for she had made the stars that they saw in their earliest moments of consciousness, and they called upon her name in times of need. When Frodo cried out, "O Elbereth, Gilthoniel," at Weathertop, wounded by the Morgul blade, he was invoking the most powerful and beloved of the Valar, the one who had set lights in the darkness and who had never ceased to watch over the elves and those who fought against evil. The name itself carried power, for Varda was one of the few Valar who had never wavered in her opposition to Morgoth, who had rejected his lies from the beginning and remained pure in her purpose. Ulmo was the Lord of Waters, and of all the Valar, he was the one who most often concerned himself with the affairs of Middle-earth after the other powers withdrew. He worked through dreams and visions, through the flowing of rivers and the crashing of waves, sending messages and guidance to those who would listen. It was Ulmo who guided Tur to Gondolin, Ulmo who preserved Voronwë when all other mariners drowned, Ulmo who worked constantly to oppose Morgoth's designs even when the other Valar had largely given up on Middle-earth. Aule was the smith and craftsman among the Valar, lord of all making and building. It was he who had taught the dwarves their skills, for indeed he had created the dwarves in secret, fashioning them from stone because he was impatient for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar and wanted beings to teach his crafts. Ilúvatar had sanctioned his creation, but only if Aule was willing to give the dwarves free will and their own life, which he did. This is why the dwarves always held Aule, whom they called Mahal, as their creator and protector. Yavanna was the Valar, who cared for all growing things, the giver of fruits and grains, the protector of plants and trees. When she learned that Aule had created the dwarves, who would inevitably cut down trees and delve into the earth, she petitioned Ilúvatar to create guardians for her plants. Thus were born the Ents, the shepherds of trees, who would watch over the forests and, in the fullness of time, would march to war against Saruman when he despoiled Fangorn. But the most tragic of the Valar was Melkor, later called Morgoth. He had been the mightiest of all the Aenir who came into the world, gifted with a share of the powers of all the others. But he desired to possess and dominate rather than to serve and create according to Ilúvatar's design. He rebelled, and in his rebellion, he became the first enemy, the source of all evil in Middle-earth. He corrupted other spirits to his service, including many of the Maiar, the lesser powers who served the Valar. Among those who fell to Morgoth's service were the Balrogs, spirits of fire who had been perverted into demons of flame and shadow. They served as Morgoth's most terrible warriors, and when he was finally defeated at the end of the First Age, some of them escaped and hid in the deep places of the world. The Balrog that the Fellowship encountered in Moria was one of these survivors, a remnant of the First Age that had slept for thousands of years beneath the mountains. Sauron had also been one of the Maiar, originally a servant of Aule, who was seduced by Morgoth's promises of power. He became Morgoth's most trusted lieutenant, a sorcerer and deceiver of tremendous skill. When Morgoth was defeated and cast out of the world, Sauron remained in Middle-earth, and in time he sought to take up his master's role, forging the One Ring as an instrument of dominion and gathering armies to conquer all the free peoples. The story of how Sauron was defeated in the Second Age, how Isildur cut the ring from his hand and then failed to destroy it, was a tale known to all the wise in Middle-earth. It explained why the ring existed, why Sauron could return even after being overthrown, and why the quest to destroy the ring was so desperately important. The past shaped the present in Middle-earth more directly than in most worlds, for beings lived who remembered those ancient times, and objects of power from the elder days still existed and could still affect the world. The tale of Númenor was another legend that cast a long shadow over the Third Age. Númenor had been an island kingdom of men, a great civilization blessed by the Valar, given long life and great wisdom. For centuries, Númenor had been a beacon of light, sending aid to Middle-earth and opposing Sauron's growing power. But pride and the fear of death corrupted the kings of Númenor, and Sauron, captured and brought to the island as a prisoner, used his cunning to corrupt them further. He convinced them to worship Morgoth instead of Ilúvatar, to seek immortality by force, to sail to Valinor in a great armada and demand eternal life from the Valar. It was a blasphemy without equal, and the result was catastrophic. The Valar laid down their guardianship of the world and appealed directly to Ilúvatar. The Creator intervened, opening a great chasm in the sea that swallowed the fleet and the island of Númenor itself. The world was changed from flat to round, and Valinor was removed from the physical world entirely, placed forever beyond the reach of mortals. Only a small number of Númenorians survived, those who had remained faithful and who had fled the island before its destruction. They were led by Elendil and his sons, and they founded the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor in Middle-earth. From them descended Aragorn, and through him, the ancient glory of Númenor was at last redeemed and renewed. These myths and legends were not merely stories to the people of Middle-earth. They were explanations of why the world was shaped as it was, why certain powers existed and others had faded, why the sun and moon crossed the sky, why death came to men but not to elves. why evil persisted in the world despite the power of the Valar to oppose it. They were the foundational narratives that made sense of existence, that gave meaning to suffering and hope for redemption. When Sam stood in Ithilien and wondered whether he and Frodo would be put into songs, when he imagined future generations telling the tale of Frodo and the Ring, he was participating in this ancient tradition. He understood, perhaps better than Frodo in that moment, that their journey was part of a much larger story, that the quest they were on had roots in the music of the Ainu and would have echoes in ages yet to come. The great legends of the past were not dead history, but living memory, patterns that repeated, themes that recurred, showing that courage and sacrifice mattered in every age, that the choices of individuals could shape the fate of the world. The Rings of Power and their terrible history. Among all the objects of power that existed in Middle-earth, none were more significant or more terrible than the Rings of Power. Their creation, their distribution, and their ultimate purpose were central to the great conflicts of the Second and Third Ages. The lore of the rings was preserved in verse and in ancient records, known to the wise and whispered as warnings to those who might be tempted by promises of power. In the Second Age, when Sauron still could take a fair form and deceive those who did not know his true nature, he came to the elven smiths of Eregion, disguised as a teacher and friend. He called himself Anatar, which means Lord of Gifts, and he offered to teach the elves the secrets of ring-making, of crafting objects that could preserve and protect, that could slow the decay of time and preserve beauty in a world that was always changing and fading. The elven smiths, led by Celebrimbor, the greatest craftsman among them and a descendant of Feanor himself, welcomed Sauron's teaching. Together, they created the Rings of Power, objects of tremendous skill and magic. They made many rings as practice and experiments, but the greatest were the 9 and the 7 and the 3. 7 rings were given to the dwarf lords, who treasured them and used them to increase their wealth and the glory of their kingdoms. But the dwarves proved resistant to Sauron's domination. The rings could not make them into his slaves as he had intended. Instead, the rings inflamed the dwarves' natural love of gold and treasure, making them greedy and possessive, bringing dragon fire and ruin to their kingdoms through the very wealth the rings helped them accumulate. By the end of the Third Age, some of the 7 had been destroyed, others reclaimed by Sauron, and their power in the world had greatly diminished. 9 rings were given to men, to kings and sorcerers and great warriors who desired power and the ability to rule. These rings gave their bearers long life and great power, but they came with a terrible price. Slowly, over years and centuries, the 9 corrupted and consumed those who wore them. The wearers became wraiths, neither living nor dead, enslaved completely to Sauron's will. They became the Nazgul, the ring wraiths, the most terrifying servants of the Dark Lord, creatures of such malice and dread that their very presence could break the courage of armies. The 9 had once been mighty men, kings of Númenor and lords of other lands, but they had been seduced by the promise of power and had accepted the rings freely. They wore them and gloried in what they could do, but gradually they faded from the world, becoming shadows and slaves. Their story was a warning about the cost of power, about how even great and noble beings could be corrupted if they reached for more than was meant for them. But the 3 rings of the elves were different. Celebrimbor had crafted them alone, without Sauron's direct hand in their making, though the knowledge Sauron had taught was used in their forging. These 3 were the most powerful of all the rings save one, and they were never touched by evil, they were given to the wisest of the elves. Vilya, the Ring of Air, which was the mightiest, went to Gil-galad and later to Elrond. Narya, the Ring of Fire, was given to Círdan the Shipwright, who later bestowed it upon Gandalf. Nenya, the Ring of Water, was borne by Galadriel. These rings had the power to preserve and protect, to maintain the beauty and strength of the elven realms against the ravages of time. Rivendell and Lothlorien endured as havens of beauty partly because of the power of the rings that their lords bore. But Sauron had deceived all the ringmakers, elves and dwarves and men alike. In secret, in the fires of Mount Doom in Mordor, he forged the one ring to rule all the others. Into this ring, he poured much of his own power and malice, creating an object that would let him dominate all the other rings and their bearers. He inscribed it with words in the black speech, his own evil tongue. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. When Sauron first put on the One Ring, the elves immediately knew they had been betrayed. They perceived his intent and removed their 3 rings, hiding them and never using them while Sauron possessed the one. This thwarted his plan to dominate them, but it also meant that a great war was inevitable. Sauron demanded the rings be returned to him. The elves refused, and so began the Wars of the Second Age, in which Sauron conquered much of Middle-earth before finally being defeated by the last alliance of elves and men. Isildur, son of Elendil, cut the ring from Sauron's hand, after his father and Gil-galad together overthrew the Dark Lord. With Sauron's body destroyed and the ring taken from him, he ceased to have physical form, and his power was greatly diminished. But Isildur, rather than destroying the ring in the fires where it was made, claimed it as weregild for his father and brother, both of whom had died in the war. He took the ring, and it betrayed him, slipping from his finger when he tried to escape from an ambush, leading to his death in the waters of the Anduin. The ring was lost for thousands of years, lying at the bottom of the river, until by chance, or by the strange workings of fate that seemed to surround the ring, it was found by a creature who had once been a hobbit-like being named Smeagol. The ring corrupted him over centuries, transforming him into Gollum, extending his life far beyond its natural span, while consuming his mind and body, turning him into a twisted mockery of what he had been. The history of the ring from its loss by Isildur to its finding by Bilbo, and its ultimate bearing by Frodo, is the story told in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But throughout that story, the ancient lore of the rings provided context and meaning. The verse that Gandalf recited to Frodo in the Shire: 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, was ancient lore, a warning passed down through generations about the danger of the rings. The 3 elven rings presented a particular problem. As long as the One Ring existed, the 3 could not safely be used, for they were bound to the one in their making. When Sauron was weak and without the One Ring himself, the elves could use their rings to preserve and protect their realms. But if Sauron were to reclaim the One, he would immediately perceive where the 3 were and would be able to dominate their bearers, turning Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf into his servants, or at least making it impossible for them to oppose him effectively. This is why the quest to destroy the ring mattered so much to the elves. If the ring were destroyed, Sauron would be permanently defeated, unable ever to return in any significant power. But the destruction of the One Ring would also end the power of the three. The preserving magic that maintained Rivendell and Lothlorien would fade. The elves would no longer be able to maintain their realms in Middle-earth and would have to depart to the west or fade into shadows. The destruction of the Tichaim ring meant victory over Sauron, but also the end of the elves' time in Middle-earth. This was the sacrifice that Elrond and Galadriel and even Gandalf were willing to make. They could have chosen to keep the ring hidden, to maintain the status quo, preserving their own power while Sauron remained weakened. But they knew that eventually Sauron would find the ring, and then all would be lost. Better to end the age, to accept the fading of their own power, if it meant truly defeating evil and giving men a chance to build their own future without the shadow of Sauron hanging over them. The Law of the Rings was thus not just ancient history, but the key to understanding the present crisis. Every member of the Fellowship knew at least some version of this history. They understood that they carried not just a ring, but the culmination of thousands of years of history, the final chapter in a story that stretched back to the Second Age. They were participants in a tale that had begun when their ancestors were young, and their success or failure would determine whether that tale ended in hope or despair. Prophecies and the weight of destiny. Throughout the history of Middle-earth, prophecies and foretellings played a significant role, shaping events and giving guidance to those who sought to understand what must be done. These were not mere predictions of future events, but rather glimpses into the pattern of fate, insights into the great design that underpinned all of history. The people of Middle-earth took prophecies seriously, studying them and trying to understand their meaning, though often the true import of a prophecy was not understood until after it had been fulfilled. One of the most significant prophecies concerned the return of the king. For many generations after the fall of Arnor and the dwindling of Gondor's royal line, it was foretold that one day a king would return, that the broken sword would be reforged, that the throne would not remain empty forever. This prophecy kept hope alive in Gondor even during the darkest times, even when it seemed that the stewards would rule forever and the line of kings was lost forever. The reforging of Narsil into Anduril was itself the fulfillment of a prophecy. The sword had been broken when Isildur fell, and the shards had been preserved in Rivendell for 3,000 years, waiting for the day when they would be needed again. When the blade was reforged at the order of Elrond, it was a sign that the time of the king's return had come, that Aragorn would at last step forward to claim his heritage. Aragorn himself was the subject of many old prophecies and foretellings. His romance with Arwen echoed the ancient tale of Beren and Luthien, and Elrond, who was himself descended from that union of mortal and immortal, saw in Aragorn and Arwen a repetition of the pattern. But he also knew the price that pattern demanded, that Arwen would have to become mortal, that she would die as mortals die, leaving her father to endure eternity without her. Elrond had foreseen this possibility, and he grieved for it, but he also understood that some things were meant to be, that the pattern had to complete itself. The prophecy about the Witch King of Angmar was one of the most famous foretellings in Middle-earth. When Glorfindel, the Elf Lord, who had been reborn after his death in the fall of Gondolin, confronted the Witch King after the Battle of Fornost, he proclaimed that no living man would slay the Lord of the Nazgul. This prophecy was interpreted by the Witch King himself as a promise of invincibility, a guarantee that he could not be killed. He carried this belief with him for 1,000 years, and it made him arrogant and careless. But prophecies in Middle-earth were often fulfilled in unexpected ways. When the Witch King confronted Éowyn on the Pelennor Fields and boasted that no living man could kill him, she revealed herself and declared that she was no man. Together with Merry, who struck the Witch King with his barrow blade, a weapon specifically made in ancient times to fight the forces of Angmar, Éowyn broke the spell that protected the Nazgul Lord and destroyed him. The prophecy was fulfilled, but not in the way anyone expected. Prophecies also guided the quest of the ring itself. Gandalf's insight that Gollum had some role yet to play, that there was a purpose in Bilbo having found the ring, and in Frodo being chosen to bear it, was a kind of prophetic understanding. He did not know exactly what would happen, but he sensed that events were unfolding according to a pattern, that there was a design beneath the apparent chaos of war and danger. In the end, Gandalf's intuition proved correct. Gollum, whom Frodo had spared out of pity, was present at the very end, at the cracks of doom. When Frodo, overcome by the ring's power, claimed it for himself rather than destroying it, it was Gollum who attacked him, bit off his finger, and fell with the ring into the fire, accomplishing the quest by accident or fate. It was a fulfillment of purpose that no one could have predicted, yet it fit the pattern that Gandalf had sensed, the design that moved beneath all the choices and chances of the journey. The dreams of Faramir and Boromir, which called them to seek Imladris and the sword that was broken, were another form of prophecy. These dreams came from beyond the characters themselves, sent perhaps by the Valar, or simply rising from the pattern of fate that was working itself out in Middle-earth. They guided Boromir to Rivendell, where the Council of Elrond would decide the fate of the ring, and they shaped the course of events that followed. Even Galadriel's mirror, which showed visions of things that were, things that are, and some things that yet may be, functioned as a tool of prophecy and insight. When Frodo and Sam looked into the mirror, they saw visions that troubled and confused them, glimpses of possible futures and distant events. The mirror did not command or determine what would happen, but it gave knowledge that could shape choices, and in a world where choice and fate were constantly intertwined, such knowledge was both a gift and a burden. The nature of prophecy in Middle-earth was that it revealed without constraining. The characters were not puppets acting out predetermined roles, but rather free beings, whose choices happened to align with patterns that had been foreseen. This is why Frodo's mercy toward Gollum mattered so much. It was a free choice, made from compassion rather than strategy, and yet it was also part of the design, part of the pattern that led to the ring's destruction. Free will and fate coexisted, each real, each significant, creating a world where prophecy could be both true and mysterious, both guiding and allowing for surprise. The prophecies of Middle-earth were part of the lore that the wise studied and the common people heard in songs and tales. They gave shape to history, provided hope in dark times, and reminded everyone that they were part of a larger story, that their actions mattered not just for themselves, but for the working out of a destiny that had been set in motion at the beginning of time. In a world where the past lived on in memory and song, where the deeds of ancient heroes provided templates for present action, prophecy was one more way of connecting the ages, of showing that all of time was one great story still being told. Monsters in memory, dragons, spiders, and ancient terrors. The people of Middle-earth lived in a world where monsters were real, where creatures of tremendous size and malice dwelt in dark places, waiting to emerge and bring terror and death. These creatures became part of the folklore, the scary stories that parents told children, the warnings that kept travelers from straying into dangerous lands. But they were also real threats that had to be faced, and the tales of those who fought them became legends in their own right. Dragons were among the most fearsome creatures in Middle-earth's bestiary. They were ancient, created or bred by Morgoth in the First Age, as weapons in his war against the elves. The greatest of all dragons was Ankalagon the Black, who led the final assault in the War of Wrath, and was so immense that when he fell from the sky, slain by Erendil, he broke the towers of Thangorodrim beneath him. But Ankalagon was destroyed in the cataclysm that ended the First Age, and the dragons that survived into later ages were diminished, though still terribly dangerous. Glaurung, called the father of dragons, was wingless but still mighty, a great worm of fire who could breathe flame and whose eyes held a hypnotic power that could break the will of even strong-minded warriors. He was the dragon who destroyed Nargothrond and who tormented Turin and Nienor with his lies and his malice, playing a central role in the tragedy of the children of Húrin. When Turin finally slew him, it was counted as one of the great deeds of the elder days, for no other mortal man had slain a dragon of such power. By the Third Age, the great dragons were mostly gone, but a few survived in the far north and in other wild places. Smaug the Golden, who drove the dwarves from Erebor and claimed the Lonely Mountain as his lair, was one of the last of the great fire drakes. His destruction at the hands of Bard the Bowman was a tale that entered into legend, sung in the halls of men, and remembered as proof that even the mightiest monsters could be overcome by courage and a well-aimed arrow. The people of the north spoke of dragons with a mixture of fear and fascination. They were creatures of greed, hoarding treasure not because they needed it, but because they desired it, sleeping on piles of gold and jewels for years at a time. They were cunning, capable of speech and deception, able to engage in riddles and verbal sparring with those who dared approach them. But they were also creatures of destruction, whose very presence brought desolation, whose fire could reduce towns to ash in moments. The lore of dragons included knowledge of their weaknesses. They were vulnerable in their underbellies, where their armor of scales was thinner. A skilled archer with a strong enough bow might pierce that armor if they knew where to aim. They were also susceptible to certain enchanted weapons, particularly those forged with dragon slaying in mind. But approaching a dragon was itself almost impossible, for they could sense intruders from great distances, and their fire could reach farther than any bow could shoot. Spiders were another source of terror in Middle-earth, and none more so than Shelob, the monstrous spider that dwelt in Cirith Ungol, guarding one of the passes into Mordor. Shelob was ancient beyond reckoning, having been born in the elder days, possibly descended from Ungoliant, the terrible spider creature that had helped Morgoth destroy the two trees of Valinor, and who had nearly destroyed Morgoth himself in her insatiable hunger. Shelob had made her lair in the tunnels beneath Cirith Ungol long ago, preying on any creature that tried to use the pass, orc and elf and man alike. Sauron knew she was there and left her in place, for she served his purposes by making one of the entrances to Mordor all but impassable. He fed her with prisoners occasionally, keeping her satisfied enough that she would not leave her lair to trouble his own forces. The tale of how Frodo and Sam encountered Shelob became one of the most harrowing parts of their quest. Sam's courage in facing the monster, using the Phial of Galadriel to drive her back, and then wounding her with Sting when she sought to drag Frodo away, was an act of heroism that echoed the great deeds of the First Age. He did not slay Shelob. She retreated to her lair to nurse her wounds, but he hurt her enough that she did not pursue them further, and in so doing, he proved that even the smallest and seemingly weakest could stand against ancient terror and survive. The spiders of Mirkwood, though far smaller than Shelob, were still formidable dangers. They had infested the great forest after the necromancer established himself in Dol Guldur, and they made the forest a place of darkness and dread. Bilbo's encounter with them, and his rescue of the dwarves using his ring and his sword, was a turning point in his development from a comfortable hobbit into a true adventurer. The Balrog of Moria, known as Durin's Bane, was another monster that lived in legend and memory. It had been hiding in the deep places beneath Khazad-dûm since the end of the First Age, and when the dwarves delved too deep and too greedily in their search for Mithril, they disturbed it. The Balrog killed King Durin, destroyed the dwarf kingdom, and claimed Moria as its domain. For more than 1,000 years it dwelt there, and the once great mansions of the dwarves became a place of terror that none dared enter. Gandalf's confrontation with the Balrog on the bridge of Khazad-dûm was the climax of a pursuit that had lasted throughout the Fellowship's time in Moria. When Gandalf stood alone against the demon, declaring himself a servant of the secret fire and forbidding the Balrog to pass, he was not just protecting his companions, but standing as one of the Maiar against one of his own kind, who had fallen into evil in the service of Morgoth. The battle between them, which continued down into the deeps and then up to the peak of Ziraxigil, was a contest between ancient powers, ending in the deaths of both, though Gandalf was sent back to continue his mission, while the Balrog was destroyed utterly. Other monsters lurked in the wilds and the dark places of Middle-earth. The Watcher in the Water, whatever it was, guarded the western gate of Moria, a creature with many tentacles that nearly claimed Frodo before the Fellowship could enter the mines. The great bats that flew over Mordor, the fell beast that the Nazgûl rode, creatures that were neither bird nor beast but something else entirely, bred for war and terror. All of these were part of the bestiary of evil that Sauron commanded. In the folklore of the common people, these monsters took on almost mythical proportions, growing larger and more terrible with each retelling. A farmer in the Shire might dismiss tales of dragons as fanciful nonsense, but in Rohan and in Gondor, where the threat of Sauron's forces was real and present, people knew that monsters existed and might come at any time. The stories served as warnings, teaching children and reminding adults that the world contained real dangers, that venturing into the wild without caution could lead to death. But the stories also contained a message of hope. Monsters could be defeated. Dragons had been slain. Shelob had been driven back. The Balrog had been destroyed. Even the smallest and weakest, like Bilbo facing the spiders or Sam confronting Shelob, could triumph if they had courage and good fortune. The monster lore of Middle-earth was thus both a source of fear and a source of inspiration, reminding people that heroism was possible, that evil, no matter how ancient or powerful, was not invincible. The Undying Lands, a realm beyond reach. In the mythology of Middle-earth, no place held greater significance or mystery than Aman, the Undying Lands in the far west, where the Valar dwelt and where the elves who departed from Middle-earth would find peace and rest. It was a place that shaped the longing and the sorrow of the elves, a destination that they spoke of in songs and in quiet moments, the blessed realm that was both their birthright and for those who remained in Middle-earth, their sacrifice. Amen had been part of the world from the beginning, the place where the Vala established their own dwellings after entering the world to shape it. In ancient times, when the world was still flat, it was possible to sail there from Middle-earth, and some brave mariners had made the journey, though the way was perilous and many were lost. The elves who dwelt in Valinor, the realm within Amen, where the two trees grew, lived in the direct presence of the Vala, learning from them and dwelling in a land where nothing was marred or diminished. But that ancient connection was broken in the catastrophe of Numenor's fall, when the kings of Numenor, corrupted by Sauron, sailed to Amen to demand immortality by force. Ilúvatar intervened directly. The world was changed from flat to round, and Amen was removed from the physical world, placed in a dimension beyond normal space. After that cataclysm, no ships of mortal men could reach the undying lands, for the straight road that led there was no longer part of the physical world. But the elves retained the right to sail to Amen, and the ships that departed from the Grey Havens could still take that path, passing from Middle-earth into the realm of the Valar. This was the fate that awaited all elves eventually, for they were not meant to remain in Middle-earth forever. As men's time came and the world changed, the elves would fade, becoming like ghosts in a world no longer theirs. Their only choice was to sail to Amen, or to diminish into shadows and eventually disappear. The longing for the West was called the sea longing, and it affected almost all elves eventually. When they heard the cry of gulls or looked upon the sea, they would feel the pull of Amen, the desire to leave Middle-earth and return to the blessed realm. Some, like Círdan the shipwright, spent their entire existence building ships for others to sail west, though they themselves remained dutiful and patient, waiting for their own time to depart. Legolas experienced this longing during the quest of the ring. When he heard the gulls crying at Pelagia, the sea longing woke in him, and he knew that once the war was over, he would eventually have to leave Middle-earth. The friendship he had formed with Gimli was so deep that, when Legolas finally did sail west, he took Gimli with him, the only dwarf to ever enter Amen, a testament to the power of their friendship to transcend ancient divisions. Galadriel and Elrond also eventually departed. For them, the destruction of the One Ring meant the end of their power to preserve their realms. Lothlorien and Rivendell, sustained by the elven rings, began to fade once those rings lost their power. The time had come for them to leave Middle-earth and seek the peace of Aman. They sailed from the Grey Havens in the company of Gandalf, whose task in Middle-earth was also complete, and Frodo and Bilbo, who were granted permission to sail west as a special grace for their roles as ring-bearers. For mortals, Amen represented something unattainable, a paradise they could not reach. The prohibition on mortal ships sailing to Amen was absolute after the fall of Numenor. The round world meant that sailing west from Middle-earth would only bring you around the globe back to the east, never to the undying lands. Only by special grace could a mortal pass that boundary, and such grace was almost never granted. The exception was Frodo, who was given this gift because of the wounds he had suffered, both physical and spiritual, in bearing the ring. He could not find healing in Middle-earth, could not find peace or rest after all he had endured. So he was allowed to sail to Amen, not to gain immortality. He remained mortal and would eventually die there, but to find healing in the blessed realm before his death. It was a rare mercy, an acknowledgement of his sacrifice and suffering. In the mythology of later ages, Amen became even more distant and legendary. The people of Gondor and Rohan knew of it mainly through old stories and through the tales that the elves told. They understood that the elves were leaving, sailing away to a place that mortals could not follow, and this added to the poignancy of the end of the Third Age. The world was becoming a diminished place, losing its magic and wonder as the elves departed and the great powers faded. But there was also a promise in the lore of Aemon. It was not a place of death but of life, a realm where things did not age or decay, where beauty endured forever. The elves who sailed there were not fleeing to escape death, but going home to a place they had never seen, but that called to them in their blood. For them, Aemon was not an ending, but a returning, a completion of the circle that had begun when their ancestors first awoke in Middle-earth. The tales of Aman, the songs about the two trees and the beauty of Valinor, the stories of the Valar and their works, all of these were part of the deep lore of Middle-earth, the mythological background that gave meaning to the present. Even those who would never see Aman carried its memory in their hearts, and that memory shaped how they lived and what they valued. It was a reminder that the world had been more than it now was, and that there were still places of light and peace, even if they were beyond the reach of most who dwelt in Middle-earth. Conclusion. Stories within stories, echoes through time. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the folk tales and legends that lived within the hearts and minds of Middle-earth's people. We have walked through tales of impossible love and unbearable tragedy, of hidden cities and their destruction, of songs that shook the foundations of fortresses, and of monsters that lurked in dark places. We have heard prophecies fulfilled in unexpected ways and learned of realms beyond the mortal world's reach. What strikes us most powerfully about these stories is how they live within the larger story, how the people of Middle-earth carried their own mythology with them, drawing strength from the examples of heroes who had come before. When Sam stood in Ithilien and wondered whether he and Frodo would be put into songs, he was acknowledging that their quest was part of this larger pattern, that they were walking in the footsteps of Beren and Turin and all the others who had faced impossible odds and somehow found the courage to continue. The stories were not just entertainment or idle fancy. They were the living memory of the world, the way that cultures preserved their identity and passed on their values. When Aragorn sang of Beren and Luthien on Weathertop, he was not just passing the time, but connecting the hobbits to a tradition thousands of years old, showing them that their journey had precedence, that others had walked dark paths before and emerged into light. The folktales and legends of Middle-earth remind us that in that world, history was never truly past. The elder days lived on in song and story. The Second Age's catastrophes still shaped the geography and politics of the Third Age, and the choices made by people long dead continue to echo through the ages. This gave weight to every decision, made every act of courage or mercy significant, for who knew which deeds might be remembered and sung about for thousands of years to come. But these stories also carried warnings. The tragedy of Turin showed how pride and anger could corrupt noble intentions. The fall of Númenor demonstrated the danger of reaching for more than was granted, of seeking immortality through force rather than accepting the gift of mortality with grace. The tale of the Rings of Power illustrated how even creations meant to preserve and protect could be corrupted and turned to evil purposes. Yet running through all these tales was a thread of hope. Beren and Luthien proved that love could overcome even death itself. Tuor and Idril showed that from the ruins of the greatest disasters, new hope could be born. The small and seemingly insignificant, a hobbit, a gardener, a simple act of mercy, could change the fate of the world. These were not just stories about powerful heroes doing impossible things, but about the power of persistence, of choosing right over easy, of refusing to surrender to despair even when all seemed lost. The stories existed in layers, tales within tales, each generation adding their own verses to the ancient songs, each age finding new meaning in old legends. The people of Middle-earth understood something that we sometimes forget, that we are all part of a larger story, that the choices we make ripple outward in ways we cannot fully see, that courage and kindness matter not just for themselves, but for how they inspire others who come after. As we close this chapter of our journey together, I hope you'll carry these tales with you. Let them settle into your imagination the way they settled into the minds of the people who heard them sung in the Hall of Fire or whispered around campfires under strange stars. These are the stories that made Middle-earth feel lived in and real, that gave it depth and weight, that transformed it from a mere fantasy setting into a world with its own complete mythology and history. If you've enjoyed this exploration of the folk tales and lore of Middle-earth, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more corners of this magnificent world to explore together. Until next time, may your own path be lit by stars. May the stories you carry give you strength in dark times, and may you never forget that even the smallest person can change the course of the future. The tales continue, the songs endure, and somewhere, in some hall yet to be built, singers will tell of the deeds done in our own time, weaving them into the great story that connects all the ages of the world. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the legends we've shared tonight.